This is a another little quiz, I suppose. See if you recognize any names up there. If you know anybody who has a name that's represented up there or some variant spelling of it, you might want to ask them sometime if they know if they have any Anabaptist ancestors, because these are, of course, the names. These weren't confined to Anabaptists, to the Swiss Brethren folks, and or their converts in, say, the Netherlands, whatever. But these are some common names that I have heard in Mennonite circles, but or Amish circles. Lap is a very Mast and Lap are very Amish, but I have not heard them a lot outside of Mennonite circles. So there's a good chance that if you know someone with one of these names, that they do have ancestors in this heritage.
What's the difference between Amish?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to that.
Why don't you just take it from the top?
Okay.
And just re-welcome people.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay. Right. And I think that we can begin. So if anything did strike you, I'd be interested and curious if you ask your friend or even relative, hey, any chance that you have an Anabaptist in your past? That would be interesting. Oh, I can talk about, yeah. See this name? I don't know if my lighter works. This name right here, this is probably the most mispronounced name on here, Taves. Taves is a Mennonite name from Canada. And there is, if you're an ice hockey fan, there is a very famous hockey player by the name of Jonathan Taves, I think. I think it's Jonathan Taves. But also there is a Taves who's become a fairly well-known author, Miriam Taves. Miriam Taves has published a number of novels now, pretty much based on her heritage. She does not belong to the culture of Mennonites anymore, but it was her book that got made into that Oscar-nominated film, Women Talking. You heard of that, Women Talking? Miriam Taves wrote that. But if you hear anybody talking about her or the hockey player and call them toes, you now have some arsenal. You can say, excuse me, but that's pronounced Taves. Anyway, okay, that was just kind of fun to get your attention back on the screen, because we left off with, we've got some more Radical Reformation leaders to get to. Welcome back, by the way. Thanks. I should earnestly desire to have faith, which is life, since it is basically not to be found in me by nature. However, I would not deceive myself or others. Indeed, if I should declare today, I believe, tomorrow I could well prove myself a liar. Not I really, but the truth which I sense to some degree in my inward being. I certainly know this is in myself, that it is truth, and I shall, God willing, listen to it, whatever it will say to me. And if anyone wants to take it from me, I shall not permit them to do so. Wherever it points me, there I shall go. From whatever it drives me, I shall flee. This is Hans Denk, who is kind of our most mystic representative of Radical Reformation leaders, of Anabaptists. Maybe you could tell from that. He is writing a treatise on what he believes, because he's on trial, and they're trying to judge whether there's enough heresy in him to put him to death, or at least to this I'm quite sure was in Strasbourg, so it would have been kick him out of town. You notice how different that was from your normal theological treatise. I've read other parts of it, and I can't take the time to do it now. But it's just amazing. It's a breath of fresh air, the way he approaches this, because it's almost like he's talking to himself. He says, you know, the other day I woke up wondering, do I really believe that or not? You know, and so he's just being completely open and honest with these folks who have his life in their hands. And I think from the passage that I read, you can tell how he's following that idea of the truth not being somewhere out there in a theologian's hand or in the institution's hand, but the truth is something that gets implanted in him. And he knows it when it's true. If he's honest with himself, and sometimes he isn't, he says, but if he's honest with himself, he knows when it's true and when it's not. Hans Dink was on that list of institutions that I kind of doubted. I was spurious when I saw this college in Georgia with all these names on it. I thought, you know, do they really pay attention to who they're honoring anymore? And so I wrote to a number of the dean's offices in that list. And where is it? Last week, I didn't get any response. I just said, "What's up with your name?" You know, I basically said, "Why is your school named this?" You know, and I didn't get a response until this morning. I heard from Barry McCarty, the dean of the Hans Dink School of Communications, and I just have to share this response with you. He writes, all of 10 Truett McConnell's schools are named for Anabaptist leaders from the Reformation. Hans Dink was known for contending for truth in a spirit of love, which was the theme of his greatest work, titled Of the True Love. And then he has this quote, which apparently has been, he's enlarged or something, and he's got like it as a poster or something on his desk. And here's his quote from Hans Dink. "It gives my heart pain that I should stand in disunity with many men who I cannot help but consider my brethren, because they pray to the same God to whom I pray, and they give honor to the Father for the same reason I honor him, namely because he has sent his Son, the Savior, into the world. Therefore, as God wills, and so much as is in me, I will not have my brother as an opponent and my father as a judge, but in the meantime will attempt to reconcile all my adversaries with me." I think if you start reading Hans Dink, you too might kind of fall in love with him. And that's primarily how I want to represent him, as kind of a more mystical end on the of the Radical Reformation. And he, well, I'll get to his fate later. But he was very critically important to, let's see what these books summarize about him. A maverick Anabaptist of mystical and spiritualist leaning, who worked for a time within the General Brethren guidelines. Anyway, Hans Hut was somebody who came into the Anabaptist fold through Hans Dink. He was a book trader and book binder. So his trade brought him to a lot of places in Germany where important things were being said. Someone asked the question, given the space and population of Europe in the 1500s, how did these theologians get so much influence? And somebody else had asked about the printing press. And it would be very important to recognize that the Reformation could not have happened. The Radical Reformation could not have happened if it weren't for the printing press. And still, the primary use of the printing press was through the church. scriptures, the Bible, and tracts, and then books eventually. Or if somebody had the time and wasn't urgently trying to get their viewpoint across, there were probably books being printed very early, so that people like Hans Hut could have an occupation. But he got caught up in the zeal and excitement of the Radical Reformation, and was one of the most successful evangelists. Others claim that he did not always stick quite as true to the Schleitheim confession as others did, but he was definitely effective and brought probably more people into the fold, so to speak, than any of the other leaders we've talked about so far. And the other contribution that Hans Hut made is that one of the things that were important to him was the sharing of goods. That if we're going to be the church together, we are going to look after each other's needs, and my things are yours, and your things are mine, etc. This got developed later into the Hutterite movement, where there was an actual formal prescripted sharing of goods, where people did not hold private property at all. Most of the Anabaptists, even if they were inclined towards sharing goods, did not go that far. The Amish, for example, still believe very much in private property, but there is that communal sense still that we are here for each other. Lastly, on this list is Pilgrim Marpeck, which I wanted to include because he is our only example of a true layperson in the movement. In other words, he was not only not a preacher, but he was not academically trained, at least not in theology. He was trained in civil engineering. Pilgrim Marpeck was a civil engineer, and he had made a name for himself in Augsburg, I think. And then all of a sudden, he lost his position. He would become wealthy through his work. He was a contributing member to society, loaning even money to the city. He was in that status. He hobnobbed with the movers and shakers of Augsburg, and suddenly he had his job taken away from him. He had performed very well in his role as the civil engineer of Augsburg, but suddenly he was out of a job. And he ends up, I don't know how much else his home was probably taken from him, but he had some goods that he was able to disperse and fled the town. It was a mystery. There's no written documentation of why this happened, but his next stage in life kind of explains it. There was in Augsburg an Anabaptist church, and it is reasoned, it is surmised that what happened is Marpeck was identified with the church, and so was asked to turn in the names of the other people, and he refused to do that. Refusing to cooperate with the magistrates and turning over the names of the people that he knew were Anabaptists was enough to cost him his job, even though he was a well-respected part of the community. Because he goes from there to Strasbourg because of its more lenient nature, and he quickly gets a job he gets a job in civil engineering, gets promoted and almost immediately to the city's civil engineer and given a task. They had a lumber problem. The city had lumber up in the Black Forest. They couldn't. The only way to get it was dependent upon a small little river that was dependent upon spring. That was the only time they could float logs down. And Marpeck developed a means using dams to create a flow in that river whenever they needed it. And then he went on to create other pathways to get lumber down. So he was a hero right away and became influential. But he was not silent this time. He was active in the Anabaptist congregation in Strasbourg, and he engaged with Martin Bucer and Capito and other ministers. He wanted to keep the dialogue going, and that eventually became a problematic. Bucer said, I don't want this guy in town anymore, and so he engineered. It was a long process, but he was eventually banished from even Strasbourg because he wanted to talk about these ideas just very openly and in a friendly means. But he then turned to writing and working in places where he could encourage the unity and cohesiveness and the information, the education of the fledgling Anabaptist communities. The other reason that Marpeck is significant will be coming up here. Hans Dink, like Conrad Grebel, died of the plague fairly early in the whole process. So who knows, whatever writings would have come out of him. Hans Hut was imprisoned and died after one particularly nasty torture session. It was actually from a fire. And what happened is that his prisoners, after they brought him from his torture session, left him on his bed with a candle. The bed was of straw, and so it caught fire. And he had no, I mean, after you've gone through an extensive torture session, you don't have much life in you anyway. And so he's no way able to escape that fire. Pilgrim Marpeck was unique because in 1556, he died a natural death. Our first radical reformer to this point who died a natural death. I'm happy for him because that allowed him to accomplish a lot more than even his civil engineering. I mentioned the Hutterites. Jakob Hutter came to Moravia, where these communities were forming, largely inspired by Hans Hut. I love that name. That's one reason I included him in. There might be other. Hans Hut started talking about this idea of communal property. And these folks in Moravia, parts of Austria, really clung on to that. They just got into that idea, and they started forming, but they needed leadership. Jakob Hutter came at the right time. He sympathized with that. He was big on communal living. He helped them get organized in such a way that they were able to see a future for themselves. And he's also big on community discipline, that people have to watch themselves if they're going to be part of one of our communities. We're going to be close-knit if we're sharing goods, and you just can't leave everyone to their own devices. So and some people can handle that, and some people can't. Jakob, I guess you'd say Jakob Hutter was, or Hutter. Hoot is hat, and so Hooter, I think, is a hat maker. But he was captured. He had started working with these folks in around 1530, so he only had a few years with them, and he was caught and burned at the stake. But that was enough time. That was enough time for these communities to get enough organization and enough practice and experience about living together in community that they survived. They eventually started calling their communities Bruderhofs. This Bruderhof is a name that has stayed with them, and so you'll find them still in existence. In this continent, they came basically to the Dakotas, although I think there's one Bruderhof community in Washington somewhere, or Idaho. But basically, the Dakotas and then the southern edge of the Canadian provinces. So Manitoba and further on west, you will find Bruderhofs, and they still exist, and they still live communally, sharing their goods, and with a fairly close sense of cohesiveness. They survived despite the fact that of all the other Anabaptists, the persecution of them, the fear of them, and the opposition to them was the most strategic on the part of particularly the Catholic Church. One thing that was in their favor is that they were they became very wealthy in their communities. When they're pooling their resources and stuff, they did a lot of good for their whole neighborhood. And so like a regional prince or lord, feudal lord, would like the fact that there were Hutterites around because they contributed much, even though that was a tension. The church didn't want them, but economically you kind of appreciated them around. One of the lords who eventually kicked the Hutterites out tried to hang on to his doctor because he took his doctor from the Hutterite community, and he loved his doctor so much he tried to and he couldn't steal him from the community. The Catholic Church was strategic in their persecution. They would do things like come in and take children away from the community and put them in Catholic homes to be raised by Catholics. They would take men out of the community who were to be the leaders and put them in monasteries where they had to grow up and live and only worship in the Catholic monasteries. So they were trying to diffuse this identity that was being created. At the same time, they're kind of right in the pathway of the Turkish. The Turks were threatening Europe at that time, and that provided problems for Anabaptists who refused to pick up the sword too. That was a problem. How can you? And the Turks are invading. And one of the Anabaptists, I forget which one it was, said, "Well, I don't believe in the sword, but if I believed it was okay, if it was permissible for me to take up a sword, I'd rather take up a sword and fight the Christians than the Turks." How could you say that? He said, well, the Turk is being a true Turk. They are true to themselves. And these Christians are not being true to themselves at all. They're phony. They're being fake, and they're hurting us because of they're not legitimate Christians. It didn't help him, his case at all, by making an argument. But so the Turks would raid these Bruderhofs and steal their property and stuff, and even steal their children as well too, and bring them to be raised in Turkey. So they had a lot going against them, and yet they survived. I can't explain it to you, but they did. And they thrive thrive is relative, but they still exist today. So let's put them on our timeline. 1536 I put as where 1536 is when Hutter died, but it's a good date right in the middle of his influence on them. Okay, here we go. Let's go to the Dutch Anabaptists, because not only were people making converts outside of Zurich and the surrounding environments, but some folks were going elsewhere to escape the intense persecution of, say, in Austria. And so there developed an Anabaptist presence in the Netherlands. And I use that term loosely because the borders were less distinct. And a lot of what we call Dutch Anabaptists were actually living in Germany or even Belgium at the time. So don't stick to that geographical term of the Netherlands too closely. But Melchior Hoffman was one of the leaders who came into the Netherlands from the Swiss area. And he is the representative of apocalypticists among the Radical Reformation. He went kind of off the handle and fell into some theology that the other reformists would have really scorned or looked frowned upon. And he was also spiritualistically inclined, so he believed in direct revelation, and he also believed in the immediate return of Christ, and came under the conviction that he could bring it about. He was not acting alone. There were others. In fact, they had an argument about where Christ was going to return. And Hubmaier's conviction was that it was going to be Munster. And so he marched with an army upon Munster to bring about the return of Christ. And of course, it didn't happen. He killed a lot of people in the process, and it was a big stain. And the other Anabaptists had to deal with that, try to live that down, and try to survive in spite of, because again, they were, for the most part, strong believers in not picking up the sword against anybody, even to defend your own life. Two of the leaders who helped in that process of recouping after Hubmaier's little experiment there were the brothers Obi and Dirk Phillips, but I want to get right away to Menno Simons. I don't want to run out of time in this session. Menno Simons did a lot more than lend his name to the Anabaptists who were living in that area, that rough area of the Netherlands. He was a Catholic priest who was getting caught up in Reformation ideas and came across these Anabaptists, recognized that the majority of them were not like Hubmaier and were struggling and needed some kind of leadership to hold them together. And he said, "That's me." And so he dedicated the rest of his life to helping this community get on its feet and find some sort of structure and cohesiveness and organization. And at first, the Anabaptists called themselves Mennonists. There's another term also that they derived from there, but the name that stuck was Mennonite. So if you wondered where the name Mennonite comes from, that's where it comes from. And most of the Mennonites in this country, not all, but most of the Mennonites in this country came from that migration from the Netherlands or the Low Countries. Did I say, before we get to that migration, I'm going to bring up Jacob Ammann, because people have also asked about the Amish. What's the difference? And what I remember being told was that there was a migration of a lot of boats with Anabaptists on it. They were going up the Rhine or down the Rhine. I forget what. The Rhine flows toward the north, I think. They were going down the Rhine. And they came to a fork in the Rhine. And some folks wanted to go west, and so they took that fork, and their leader was Jacob Ammann, and they became the Amish. And the others went straight on into the Netherlands, and they became Mennonites. I don't know if that fork exists or how much truth that story bears, but it's not the whole story. It's not a complete explanation. Jacob Ammann became influential working among Anabaptists long before that trip west. And he had also some very unique ideas about discipline and distinctiveness, and we would call it nitpicking, but you've got to look a certain way. I don't know when the beard issue came into effect, but that was a stickler. Men should grow beards, but they shouldn't grow a mustache. Why? Because the Roman army did not allow beards, because they're a weakness in battle, hand-to-hand battle. You don't want somebody grabbing you by the beard and having easy access to your neck. And so beards were outlawed. So the Roman soldiers tend to have large and impressive mustaches. So in response, the Anabaptists would grow a beard, but no mustache. If you ever wondered why they look the way they do, that's the explanation I've heard. I didn't research that, but that's the explanation I've always heard. I've heard reinforcement for it, so I feel safe saying it. However, the first difference between Amish, followers of Jacob Amen, and other Anabaptists were, some were called the Knopfler, and others were called the Hafler. Most Anabaptists had simple clothes that used buttons to close their jackets. Jacob Amen insisted no buttons. It was a little bit too grandiose. They used hooks and eyes instead. So that's apparently where the Hafler term comes from. So people were known either as a button Anabaptist or a hook and eye Anabaptist. That was the first distinction between the two. And if you think that sounds strange, there's something, and I would say we ought to be patient and try to see some reasoning behind this. There's something about that kind of distinctiveness that you see coming up again and again. When I was living in Kansas, people frequently talked about some of the many versions of Mennonites, but in Indiana, Ohio, there was a group of Mennonites that were called the Black Bumper Mennonites. The Black Bumper Mennonites, because they were allowed to have cars. By the way, most of the Mennonites in Kansas, you couldn't distinguish by dress or any other way, lifestyle or any other way. But there were some in Indiana and Ohio who were known because they were allowed to have cars, but all this chrome over there was just seen as too ostentatious. It was just not becoming of a Christian. And so they were forced to paint their bumpers black so that they would not be shining. So they were known as, even though they had another name, most people referred to them as the Black Bumper Mennonites. Times do change. And I guess now we're all Black Bumper Mennonites because they don't make any chrome anymore on cars, as far as I know. We're soft Black Bumper Mennonites too. Or spongy, or whatever you call that, whatever they put on our bumpers these days. Okay, I alluded to the fact that migration was taking place, and so was evangelization, simultaneously. But mostly it was the social change that we need to see is coming from migration, and bleeding into other areas of Germany. The Palatinate was a prime destination. In other places of Austria, Moravia, Alsace, across the border in France, because France was known to be a little bit more lenient on things like this. We've mentioned the Netherlands. From the Netherlands, they moved into places like Prussia and even a portion of Poland. And then, of course, there's migration to America. And first of all, from the Netherlands, and then a second migration from the Swiss southern Germany area, and then later into Russia. And I was going to research that because that's an interesting story. The agreement that they had with Russia, the promises that were given them, and the promises that were broken, etc. But I did not finish that research. So I put the migrations up here. I put Menno Simons' date of about and Jacob Hutter's date in there. 1536, 1540, and it wasn't until 1683 that people made the drastic step of crossing the ocean, migrating. There was never any migration to England, although there were some Anabaptists who did travel to England, and there was a little bit of contact too, but there was no major presence. 1707 was that second migration from Switzerland and southern Germany. And then that migration to Russia. There were a series of migrations, but they started in 1789. I want to talk about the effects of all this migration a bit. one of the things that it changed the nature of the church from the movement, from an urban movement, because it started in Zurich, and it was just natural for cities where things were being, information books were, or pamphlets were being spread. It was natural for fakers and daring people and people who were dissatisfied with the status quo to come from the cities. But there was a little bit more safety in rural areas. It wasn't completely safe, but it was a little bit more safety. And of course, a lot of these peasants who felt left out of life were were very amenable to hearing and catching on and taking the step of being rebaptized, etc. So there's a movement from urban to rural, and a movement from the upper middle class to the lower class at the same time. That fits dovetail with the urban to rural trend. But don't think that there weren't always a good number of upper class people who were attracted by the Radical Reformation and were involved. And then also from a schooled environment to a non-schooled environment. So there was a natural tendency to steer away from what the books teach you about theology, etc., and more of an openness to let's discover this as a community, what is going on here in the scriptures. We also need to talk about the effect of persecution. Migration was one of those effects of persecution. I'm trying to look without my glasses. I'm trying to look at the clock. 25 till? Okay. And we have until 2. So we have 25 minutes. Oh, we have until 2:30. That's right, because we started at 1. Okay, good. We're not in trouble yet. Yes. Okay. All right. And there's a particular discussion we are going to have. So I'll just bring us to that point of discussion. I was going to read some of these stories in here, but some of them are a little bit hard to hear, to read. And some people have known to cry in reading some of these stories. And so I think that I will just tell you about some of them. This is Anna Hendryks, or Anneken, as she's also called sometime, and Hendryks is spelled different ways. But I included her because of she's being raised there on a ladder into a fire, because of her conversation that is recorded with her neighbor, the neighbor that turned her in. And her response to him was just, hey, you know, what are you doing? I'm still the same person I was before you knew I was an Anabaptist. And even as she is being taken away to her execution, she addresses her neighbor who was in their court, interestingly, and she warns him. She says, this is going to strike you pretty soon, that what you're doing is wrong here, and that I have no reason to be put to death. And for the sake of your soul, I encourage you in the days to come to repent, so that you won't be doing this to other people. And I was just kind of touched by her. A lot of these people will give in their court cases, and that will give a statement of faith. And it sounds just like it could be coming from any church you've ever been to, you know, about their intense faith and their relationship with God, and their love for Jesus Christ, and their servanthood to Jesus Christ. So it's one of the effects of reading this is you can't, until you see the backstory, it's hard to understand why are these people being put to death. And that's one of the questions I think we need to ask of the Reformation. You know, it wouldn't have, well, no, I don't say that. It's hard for us to understand why neighbors could turn their neighbors in like this. But for one thing, we know that stories were being told about them that were not true. You know, those Anabaptists, they completely disregard marriage. They believe in polygamy and anything goes. Never any evidence of that, you know? Not even our friend Melchior Hoffman, who believed that Jesus was coming back if he'd only get an army to Munster. And so there is a tendency always to paint people in a different light. And even leaders were known to make this kind of misrepresentation. People have studied Calvin's writings about the Anabaptists and have seen, oh, he was fed some false information. And some other people say, or was he? Was he being, I think the verdict is going towards he was fed false information. I don't know, but false information is one thing. But then again, the very nature of what they're doing, I can see how church officials would be eager to encourage their congregations. These folks are about to destroy the church. They don't believe in baptizing children. How is that not going to destroy the church? You know, our existence depends on getting rid of these folks. I'm getting a little off the subject here. This is another story that's kind of heartbreaking. Here you see the execution has already taken place. This is Maeyken Wens, the death of Maeyken Wens. I include these two women in the list just because, you know, when you're making a list of people who are influential in the Radical Reformation and they're all males, you begin to wonder, and then you say, well, that's the times. Men were expected to lead, women were not. It's not that they were not important. This Reformation could not have taken place without the printing press. It could not have taken place without the women Anabaptists. There's just their names aren't as well used in the history books, but they're in here. There are a lot of them in here, and their stories are worth reading. And Maeyken's contribution to this book is her letter, her heartfelt letter to her son, her eldest son, when she realized that she'd been in prison and tortured for several months. And this would have been the Netherlands at a time when the Catholics were in charge. I don't think that the Calvinists, when they were in charge in the Netherlands, did outright persecution. At least I've not heard of it. But anyway, Maeyken is writing this heartfelt letter to her son and telling him about how to continue to encourage him to keep walking in faith and trusting the Lord and being responsible now he was responsible for all the younger kids, you know, and she was encouraging him to pick them up in your arms and kiss them often, you know, and kiss them for me, you know, because I can no longer do that. Kiss them for me. And how important it was that he remained steadfast in the faith. This is a picture of that oldest son. He's the one turning away from us. So we don't see his face, but he's looking through the ashes on the ground. The youngster to his left is his youngest brother, who's about 3 years old. Adrian is the son, and Jan Matthäus is the 3-year-old. And his mother had been tongue screwed. You know, they did that as not only torture, but they found that these Anabaptists would sometimes break out singing as they were burning. And they didn't like that. That looked bad to the executioners. You know, it might make an effect on somebody. because they were being steadfast to their faith and singing a hymn. And so they would screw their tongue against the roof of their mouth before they would burn them at the stake. And so what Adrian, the eldest son, he's 15, what he's doing is sifting through the ashes to locate that tongue screw to keep it as a keepsake of his mother's existence and of her life and death. Here's an interesting story, also from the Netherlands. I chose ones that had pictures, had engravings in here, so that hopefully is saving some time in my presentation. But Dirk Willems was being chased. They were trying to arrest him, and so he's running. He runs across I think it's a river. It could be a lake. I don't think. But he runs across this river to get away, and his pursuer, the person trying to arrest him, falls through the ice because it's not all that solid. And so Dirk turns around, because the poor guy's evidently can't swim or something, he's drowning. And so Dirk turns around and helps him out of the water. His pursuer then arrests him, and the next day he's burned at the stake. Dirk is burned at the stake. Now, it may be important to know, I don't know, it may be important to know that the pursuer was being watched and commanded by a superior magistrate. He was acting on orders, but it still is an irony that his life is saved by the person he's about to be turned over to be burnt. I could not research this, but I'm going to tell it anyway because it was told to me, I think, in good faith. Don't think that people didn't raise questions about this, the ethics of this. And Luther was asked, how can I, as a civil person, I mean, I'm supposed to be part of the police force, how can I, in good conscience, capture and kill another Christian? And I heard that this is one of the ways in which Luther used his two kingdom philosophy, that there is the kingdom of Christ, the church, and there is the kingdom of the world, or the civil world. And the idea was that, no, as a Christian, you can't do this. But you take off that hat and put on your civil hat, and as a servant of the political entity in which you live under, the city, or the prince, ultimately, you can do it. It is allowed in the civil order. So that is one way of addressing this. This is another way from, this sheds a little bit more light from Calvin's point of view. One of the things that it's not known for sure that how much a role he had in Michael Servetus's death. And it's been argued that he had no authority, even who he was. He had no authority to tell the council they had to kill him. But we do have some of his writings. Well, the first writing is actually from his letter to Henry VIII, when he hears that Anabaptists have gone into England. It's just a small group of them to share their ideas. And he writes to Henry VIII that they ought to be stamped out very quickly. It is better for a few Anabaptists, I forget what he called them, but a few Anabaptists to burn a few Anabaptists at the stake than for thousands to burn in hell. So you see, he was under this conviction that the Anabaptists were going to end up in steering people away from what he understood to be the truth. He was not acting as a mean-spirited person who hated his fellow humans, as we would see it in our culture. But he had some strong, I think everyone would agree that Calvin had some strong theological opinions. The second is taken from a letter he wrote to someone who was telling him that Michael Servetus wanted to come and talk with him. Michael Servetus had been talking with the Anabaptists in Switzerland, and now he wanted to come and talk with Calvin. And so that mistakenly led some people to believe that Michael Servetus was an Anabaptist, which he was not. He was a Unitarian. I had not really studied him much, so I've heard that people talk about Michael Servetus a lot in terms of Calvin's ethics. But I had not studied it until very recent. This is a letter to the person who said he's coming, he wants to talk with you. And he, well, he doesn't say that he has the power to do so. He kind of alludes that he doesn't have the power to do so, but he aligns himself with someone who would want to see Michael Servetus dead. Because he says, to any extent I can influence it, I will make sure he doesn't leave here alive. Calvin does come out and say that, if this quotation is true from this letter. And we know that he did participate in the trial. So, but this is, I'm sorry, this is not from that letter. That letter exists. This is from after the fact when Calvin is getting a lot of this heat. You know, how could you put someone to death like that? You know, how could you even participate in somebody's death like this? And this is his defense. This is Calvin's defense. Whoever shall now contend that it is unjust to put heretics and blasphemers to death will knowingly and willingly incur their very guilt. This is not laid down on human authority. It is God who speaks and prescribes a perpetual rule for his church. And he went on to say that all of these accusations about him, complaints about what he did, stirred up his anger so much that he says, I wish I had Servetus back here so I could kill him again. That's a paraphrase. He didn't admit that he himself did it, but he was proud that he had a role in it. So that's where that stands. And I don't know if I'll worry about it anymore. I don't know if I need to, and I don't even know you need to, but that was the result of my searching to get to the bottom of what may have actually happened. What I see in this response is that we've got to remember what's going on here is not just two parties at odds, but two parties that believe they're doing the will of God. Michael Servetus, I don't know much about him, but he must have felt it very important to celebrate a single person God, and not get distracted by this Trinity thing that he could not find in the scriptures. And John Calvin felt that this was blasphemy. And so they're both acting on their convictions for God. I think that's what we have to take from the existence as it was. What was the effect of it? Oh, yes, a good time for a question. Yes. We'll get the microphone to you. I'm sorry, I didn't prepare Barry to be on his toes. I went ahead.
Yes, one of the questions that came up when I've been reading about Servetus is the question of the elect and the unelect, and that from Calvin's teachings, that how did that play into the whole ideas about Anabaptists, the elect, the unelect, and what happens to those who are unelect, and that because again, the idea of the elect certainly continues down through at least the 20th century in this country.
Okay, right, and that's a good question, but I think that we will not go into depth with that because it's more of a theological question, and it's something we can maybe work out, on our own. So I want to appreciate the question without attempting to respond very much in depth to it. But, right. The effect of this persecution on the Anabaptists themselves was to make them look inward, to avert more of their attention toward themselves. The world out there is not safe. We need to, and we aren't going to use the sword to protect ourselves, but we need to protect ourselves in other ways. So they concentrated on what was going on in their midst and how can they support each other through this ordeal, and how can they take advantage of each other and growing in their conviction and in their faith. And so the term grew up that was used to describe not just the Amish, but a lot of the Anabaptists. They're the quiet in the land. Because when the world out there is hostile to your very existence, you don't want to, I should say it's natural. Not everybody is a Pilgrim Marpeck who say, well, let me go talk about this. I could survive here in Strasbourg very well. I've got a good job now. Everybody likes me. I can survive very well. I want to talk about my faith. We're not all there. The majority of the Anabaptists were very easily led into turning inward and not having undue confrontation outside where it may get them in help. It also made them very industrious. That's one of the reasons that the Hutterites were very successful. There was something, it was besides that common holding of good, but there's something about turning inward. Okay, where can we put our energies? And they turned their energies into be very industrious, particularly as farmers, but in other trades as well. Even scholastically, some turned to the academy and really became avid scholars and seekers after truth. The other thing that the persecution, the other effect that it had, was to let them reflect on and honor their tradition, who they were. They were enough convinced that they were right and they were wrongly treated. But what they were fed their spirit. And this book, and that lasted, this book became very important as soon as it was published, I think in the 1700s. And even back to where I had contact, when I was actively involved in the church in Kansas, this was quite often still considered a wedding gift. I don't know how. It doesn't read like a wedding gift, but this represented where they came from. And it was rare to find a Mennonite home that did not have a copy of the Martyr's Mirror alongside their Bible. And I already mentioned how that focus on heritage affected me by causing me to realize that my spiritual heritage was in John Wesley. And what do I know about John Wesley? And so when I was in the Mennonite seminary, I wrote a 25-page paper on a particular quality of a particular aspect of John Wesley's theology. And I became a better Wesleyan or a better Methodist because of my contact with the Mennonites. Something else that becomes obvious is that Mennonite identity is kind of like Jewish identity. No matter how active you remain in church, you are a Mennonite. No matter if you go to synagogue or not, you are Jewish. That's true too. And there's such a thing as called the Mennonite game. And that's when two Mennonites who have never met each other before, they may be from different parts of the country, they get together, they see how long it takes before they find a common friend or a common relative that they hold in common. It usually doesn't take very long. Dutch bingo, oh. So there's a little bit of inbreeding going on too. I don't mean that in a strict sense. Inbreeding. I don't think that Mennonites ever marry their cousins even. And we'll pause for one quick question here.
Quick, I know from your bio, Phil, that you did pastoral work for 10 years in a Mennonite community. And I just wondered what about the spirituality or the culture of that community drew you to it? And I guess we're hearing a little bit of that here. But I'm wondering.
It was the, to be honest, it was the radical nonconformist. I was fairly naive, or at least conservative, through high school because I lived outside of U.S. culture. I grew up outside of U.S. culture. And so I came back and there was a counterculture. I missed it. You know, I came to college in 1973, I think, 73. And so I was very curious about what this counterculture was all about, you know, and I lived in Washington, D.C., so Nixon was still in office. And he resigned when I was a student there in Washington, D.C. So my life was very political, and I was very intrigued by these radical people who were more radical than I thought. I never heard of that wing of the church before. People who were not engaged in war by conviction of their Christian faith, things like that. So that's what attracted me. So I basically went to the seminary in Elkhart to figure out what biblical pacifism was all about. And then I got caught into some work. I spent 2 years as a teacher, basically a volunteer teacher. Mennonites have these households all around the country that they call voluntary service units. And young people basically go there, spend a year or two of their life without earning money, but working for the good of another community in some kind of social work usually. And so I spent 2 years there. There was a Mennonite over across the bay in Berkeley at in the Graduate Theological Union. I went over, I enrolled in the Pacific School of Religion, which is part of the Graduate Theological Union, and was supported by the local Mennonite, young adult Mennonite congregation in San Francisco. By the way, I got to live in Haight-Ashbury those 2 years. That was a unique experience for someone who had missed out on the counterculture. And then spent 4.5 years as an associate pastor, an interim as at about 2 years, 1.5 to 2 years in Nebraska as a pastor, and then went off to Washington to rejoin my Methodist roots and whatever. The rest that's too much. Barry wanted more of my life story, and he got it out of me eventually through the back door. Well, and where did I grow up? I'm sorry. Yes, the question was, where did I grow up? As if that matters a whole lot. But I spent my formative years in Spring Lake. All my relatives, including my parents, come from Holland, but I spent my formative years until I turned 13 in Spring Lake, and that's when we moved out of the country. So, anyway, not too far from here. Puerto Rico, which is not technically out of the country, but it's certain that back then it certainly felt so. I was a high school student. My father was a minister. Here. Okay, then we're going to go right back to our topic matter. Okay, that's more than the Mennonites can be blamed for in my life. My father is a pastor of an English-speaking church outside of San Juan. So, anyway, what is the legacy? We're spending the rest of our time talking about the legacy of this Radical Reformation. And formally, as far as church entities exist, the legacy of the Radical Reformation include the Amish, the Hutterites, and the Mennonites. Of that, the Mennonites are the most abundant. Also the least defined. There are different orders of Amish as well. But they aren't as diverse. I mean, they are a lot more diverse, believe it or not, than the Hutterites even. And we are basically still agriculturally based, but not completely. They have a lot of industries too that they have started. They're still as industrious as ever. They don't write much about themselves, but there was an Englishman who got caught up in their story and decided to start a community in England, a Bruderhof in England. And I don't know how officially Hutterite it is, but he wrote extensively. His name is Eberhard Arnold. So if you want to read more about the legacy of the Radical Reformation through the Hutterites, that I was going to come up with a list of books and resources, and I didn't. But that name, Eberhard Arnold, would be one direction to turn in. Now, there were other groups that were affected by the Radical Reformation. Well, everybody was in a sense. I will be soon arguing. There are other groups that were affected by them, but these are the direct descendants. Like the Mennonites were able to talk with some people who were interested in England, and the separatists sent people over to the Netherlands to talk with the Anabaptists there in the Netherlands. So there was some information being passed on, but you find that historians argue about how exactly influential it was. Even more so with the Baptists. Some Baptist historians say there was a direct link of conversation between them, and other Baptist historians say no. They're named similarly, the Anabaptists and Baptists. They have some similar views, but there is no direct. It's more like instead of being offspring or grandchildren of the movement, they were neighbors and talked across the fence a little bit. So that's why I did not include it. It goes for the Quakers too. There are some similarities there. And in this country, there was a lot of connection between the Quakers and the Anabaptists did feel a lot of affinity. In fact, that first migration was to Pennsylvania. Germantown was the first settlement of the Mennonites in the country. And they soon identified quickly with Quakers, and some Quakers after their contact with the Anabaptists, they said, "Hey, we have Quakers who have slaves." This is it was still in the 1680s. We have Quaker friends who still have slaves. And so they write a treatise about slavery for the sake of their fellow Quakers. And it is, you can still go to Germantown and read it. It is the first anti-slavery document ever printed in this country. 1688, if I recall right, is the actual date of that. So again, here's some influence that's not formal and not direct. The other aspect we can look at in terms of legacy is on their beliefs. Their belief about baptism was so radical that it incurred that hatred, that somebody quoted as some statement about scoundrels or something like that. And we've heard what Luther called them, the Schwarmer fanatics. And people, the Catholic Church as well as the Protestants felt threatened by this, even though I have to go back and remember that Zwingli's point of view, Zwingli's theology that he started out with, and even Martin Luther's theology, if you go back to read some very early things that Martin Luther wrote, he's not far from Anabaptism. They're very close, even on issues of sacraments like communion and even baptism. But it was the realities of life, the realities of trying to preserve your Reformation that caused them to draw the line and keep the Anabaptist on the outside of that. And then this whole notion of the radical, absurd, and scary notion of the separation of church and state. You know, it's almost the norm. There are very few places where we can go today and find the state and church linked like they were. So legacy-wise, in baptism, we still have difference of opinion on when to baptize, but it's not the contentious issue that it was before. You know, we can let each other do what we do. I have ministered in both situations. I feel as much affinity as I feel for the Anabaptists. I feel very comfortable baptizing children. I love to baptize children. I baptized my first child when I was still a Mennonite pastor. I was in the hospital as a chaplain. And nobody gave me heck for it. So it's not the same issue as it was back then. And maybe partly because of the stance that the Anabaptists took way back in the 16th century. Definitely this whole idea of church and state, somebody had to do it eventually. Even if it meant they had to be shut down, almost wiped out. You know, the movement came close to the other reformers in the Catholic Church were almost successful in wiping it out continually, but it didn't. And some people say that, well, we'll get into that maybe a little bit later if I can find a video. Another aspect of the legacy that I wanted to bring up was this idea of pacifism. And they often called it non-resistance. Non-resistance to the evil that someone wants to do to you. Going back to teachings of Jesus about turning the other cheek. And basically, there's one gospel text that says, do not resist evil. Do not resist evil. When this whole picture of recovering this Anabaptist vision, this Radical Reformation, and bringing it back to light and looking at it and studying it for it to find its place in history. When this all took place, there was a simultaneously movement within churches like the Mennonite Church, where they tried to recover for themselves this radical vision, this Anabaptist vision. What does it mean for us? And how does it affect us today? What do we believe about it, today, and how do we practice it today? And one of the things that they looked at, with the help of further biblical studies that showed that the Greek word for resist did not mean what our English word resist means. It means do not return in kind. Do not respond. If somebody slugs you, don't slug them back. Do not return in kind. In fact, in one of the gospel texts, it is even spelled out in those words. Do not repay evil for evil. I think that's a different occasion, but it's still the words of Jesus and the same notion, probably just putting in different words what the Greek word resist actually means. Do not repay evil for evil. So they looked at this, and instead of being pacifist in the sense of the quiet of the land, instead of being non-resistant in the terms of not getting involved in that evil worldly stuff, they saw that what their heritage was calling them to do was to morph into what they began to calling resistant nonviolence. So we are not just going to sit back and let evil have its way. We are not going to repay, we're not going to return in kind. We are not going to think that we can solve the problem by raising an army or joining an army, but we are going to find nonviolent ways to be an active resistance to the evil in our world. So when I was involved in that young adult Mennonite church, we were always going to anti-war, nuclear war rallies and things like that, and on other social issues. where it was now seen as the thing to do, the norm to do, is we have to express our faith by actively resisting some things in our world. One more autobiographical thing. When I was a member of that small Mennonite fellow church in San Francisco and a student in Berkeley. Berkeley's not far from Lawrence Livermore, where they do all the nuclear weapons research. When we were back at the 5 minutes to midnight, kind of thing, I decided one year that I had to join a Good Friday protest at Lawrence Livermore. I was not going to let my grandchildren know that I sat back and did not express my resistant voice. And so with a lot of others, I sat with a cross in my lap, sat in front of the gates. And they had to take us away that day, that Good Friday, before they could get in through those gates. Ended up getting a month sentence for that. But when I was in jail for that sentence, I got a letter of support from the moderator of the General Conference Mennonite Church. That's the head honcho. They don't have popes or bishops even anymore. They used to have bishops in the Mennonite Church, but he was the head person of the whole country, Mennonite Church, and even beyond the borders of the country, sent me a letter of support. So it's a little bit of how the legacy plays out. Other churches, I would have been frowned at. People would have not talked about me had I done that. And I got a letter from Stanley, I forget his last name now. And it means a lot when you're going through something like that. Let's see, here's where that video comes in. I think I want to skip it. If we have time, I'll show you a video as a last little quiz or test. But I think one of the questions we need to seriously ask when going back from our perspective, we can't just judge other people, the good or the bad of the situation, just carte blanche. When we live in a different world, we got to remember that and give the Catholic Church a break, give them the benefit of the doubt, look at it from their point of view. Same with Luther and Calvin and Zwingli, fighting to make something happen and not wanting something to derail it, as well as looking at the integrity and the faith and the conviction of people who had an opinion that went out in the end. It almost got stamped out, but went out in the end. But we need to ask, were these folks standing up for convictions? Were they dying for an ideology? When I read some of these stories again recently, I thought, she knows her family is being torn apart. Her children are being robbed of their mother. Couldn't she just recant and not mean it? She probably could have gotten off the hook, or actually, I don't know that for sure, but that's what I was feeling, that she could have gotten off the hook. And wouldn't it have been better? What's to separate these folks from Jim Jones' crowd, in Guyana, drinking the Kool-Aid? I know there is a difference, but that kind of question raises up, and I think we need to address it. Where do we draw the lines? How do we define certain things that are going on? Some people would have said I was stupid for spending a month in a jail over the nuclear issue. There's not a one easy cut answer, but I think it's a question that we need to raise and ask ourselves. I think too that it helps to look at this in terms of our way of thinking politically. Was the Radical Reformation, were these Anabaptists being conservative or progressive? Because we like to put people in camps. Now, the regular Reformation was trying to go back to the days of Constantine, when there was no threat to the unity of church and state. That bond between church and state took place when Emperor Constantine became emperor and then decided that Christianity would be the state religion. And that was being threatened now. And so the Reformation was, in a sense, conservative in that they wanted to go back to the way things were. They wanted to make the empire great again. They wanted to go back to the days of Constantine, and from that perspective, okay. Whereas the radicals wanted to go all the way back to the early church, before the days of Constantine, when the church and state got connected together. And so does that make them even more conservative than Martin Luther and John Calvin? Just again, I don't know if that makes any much of a difference, but I think it's a useful question to ask. And once I asked that question, I thought, well, wait a minute. As far as humanity goes and our religious inclinations, the early church was not the beginning. In the pre-Greco-Roman world, and in many what we call more primitive areas today, there is a union between political authority and religious authority. There wasn't this separation of church and state. You know, you lived in a village and your religious authorities were your political authorities. And it seemed to be that things worked out pretty fine. Part of the idealist in me wonders whether things work out better the way Calvin and Luther and Zwingli pictured it, having a political support as well as, and then the other side of me says, well, there's no way you can do that anymore. We can't just accept letting a politician tell us how we are to believe. So Phil, stop your questions and just face reality. We live in a pluralistic society where we value that separation of church and state. Anyway, I hope that stirs up some questions in your mind, because oh, I guess I can't type on this, I don't think, and still show it to you. So I put these on here, just a sample question that we could be asking, so I could add some more to this. I won't be able to add them on the screen, but one of the questions that, in terms of a lesson, we might learn from the Radical Reformation is, if religious nationalism is on the rise, as people are talking today, if religiously based nationalism is on the rise again, how do we even locate a proper role for religion in our culture? Is religion becoming a threat? Do we use religion to fight religion, to fight against this idea of church and state deciding everything for us, according to their, what does the Radical Reformation, what information does it have? What experience does it have that helps us to see our own present situation? And then, since there was so much that happened in the persecution of the Anabaptists because of false information being spread about them, how can we combat false characterizations of persons deemed in our own day as undesirable? Can we learn any lessons from that? Well, that's enough. And you can respond to anything I've just now said about conservatism or progressive or lessons to be learned. Respond to any of that or come up with something new.
I've got to say, you've really left us with a lot to think about, and we're very much appreciative.